Las armas y el varón heroico canto, el ser, valor, prudencia y alto esfuerzos de aquel cuya paciencia no rendida por un mar de disgustos arrojada, a pasar de la envidia ponzonosa. Los hechos y proezas va encumbrando de cuellos españoles valorosos, que en la occidental India remontados, descubriendo del mundo lo que esconde, plus otra con braveza van diciendo, a fuerza de valor y brazos fuertes, en armas y quebrantos tan sufridos, cuanto de tosca pluma celebrados. I sing of arms and the heroic man, the being, courage, care, and high emprise, of him whose unconquered patience, though cast upon a sea of care, in spite of envy slanderous, is raising to new heights the feats, the deeds of those brave Spaniards who, in the far India of the West, discovering in the world that which was hid, plus ultra go bravely saying, by force of valor and strong arms, in war and suffering as experienced, as celebrated now by pen unskilled. So starts New Mexico's Iliad, Historia de la Nueva Mexico, written by its own Homer, Gaspar, Pérez de Villagrá. Unfortunately, the work was forever doomed to be read more as a history than as a poem. On the style chosen, Villagrá chose the New World epic, a text that, per the daring flight of my pen, quote, usually celebrates heroic action, recalls a mythos of the nation, dramatizes the battles that install empire, and then projects a people's proud future as part of a great empire, end quote. Unlike most of this style, instead, quote, his epic projects a future for the Spaniards cursed for the cruelty of their natal colonial encounters with indigenous people, end quote. The poem itself can be roughly cut into 4 sections. The first few cantos cover everything in New Mexico up to Oñate. It includes the mythical origins of the Aztecs from Aztlan, far to the north, clearly trying to link the Aztecs to the Pueblos. An interesting thing Villagrá does here is describe the Aztecs as nearly European in dress and bearing. He also describes how they became pagan and the founding of Tenochtitlan. Quote, to close within its mighty strips the lofty walls of Carthage, but where on a hard solid rock, girded by waters crystalline, a cactus planted you shall see, upon whose thick and spreading leaves a beautiful red-tailed eagle sits, quite enormous, and it be eating greedily on a great snake that in his claws, as you shall see, is twisting but well gripped, end quote. And for those of you who are familiar with the Mexican flag and the myths surrounding the founding of Mexico City, the eagle with a snake in its grasp is very familiar. He also describes the earliest Spanish expeditions. When discussing the Coronado expedition, he includes the following reasoning for why the expedition was forced to turn back. Quote, because they had not traveled, stumbling over many bars of gold and silver fine, and since they saw the fountains clear, booklets and lakes did not pour out gilded soups, cakes, and sausages. They set themselves to curse the land, and everyone who wished them to be out, and snared into such a place, end quote. He also reveals the fate of Coronado and his men after the expedition. Sometimes he kind of breaks from the history and talks about things that happen in the future as at the same time as events that he's describing, such as when he talks about here's what happens to these people who were with Coronado. Around Canto 5 is where I would end the history section and get to, hey, this is what I actually did section of the poems. Starting with Canto 6, he gets into Oñate and his expedition, starting with why Oñate was chosen. He gives the following reasons, quote, and so he wrote the viceroy to be kind. Enough, since that emprise had not been given to Captain Francisco de Urdaneta, to trust it to himself alone, since he did not know about him, knew that he had just those strengths which would suffice for such a grave matter of such import as that he asked and begged of him. End quote. He also talks a little bit about the contract itself, with such as the following, quote, so Don Juan asked that but one point be for himself demanded, and no other thing, and 'twas that he be given a free hand and power to give the whole of punishment, or pardon, if it should seem best, to those who had entered against command, for it were possible that they'd acted so nobly that it would be just, to let all these go with their lives, end quote. This can also be seen as some foreshadowing of some of the events of the expedition, such as when Oñate is going to demand the executions of several men on the expedition. This second section of the poem can kind of be described as hurry up and wait It describes a lot of the delays and problems the expedition ran into when it was trying to get off the ground. We talked about a lot of these during the main narrative as well. During this too, Villagrá gets as close to actually criticizing the Spanish government as he could without actually getting himself into trouble when the Spanish censors would review the document he was preparing. He does this by comparing the king and the viceroy and the other royal officials to the bickering gods of the Aeneid and the Odyssey. Villagrá himself had attended university in Salamanca and would have been very familiar with these classical poems. And there's a lot of that kind of classical imagery that bleeds through into the poem itself. He continues to describe the delays up through Canto 10 when the expedition finally actually gets underway and is heading to New Mexico. One interesting rhetorical strategy Villagrá employs is to not portray Oñate as the fearless Aeneas. Instead, he repeatedly fails to meet the challenges posed to him. The opening of the poem, however, would make one naturally want to think of the first governor of New Mexico as the hero, as one of noble blood. Instead of being straight with his men, though, and rallying them, he's forced to resort to lying to them. Villagrá is clearly trying to advocate for the poor soldier that had risked everything on the venture, a group that conveniently included the author. Where normally the New World epic style of poetry would have a singular hero, Cortez in the case of the conquests of Mexico, our poem has given Villagrá nothing to work with, and that shows through how, by the end of the poem, Oñate is not even included, pretty much not even included anymore. The next few cantos cover the adventures of the expedition as it heads north, with Canto 13 covering the plight of a native woman, Polka, who is anguished by love. This is a literary segment that's a standard of the New World epic style, and not necessarily reflective of exactly how the actual events went down. Cantos 13 to 16 also cover regular events of the expedition, such as the arrival in Pueblo land, the establishment of San Juan de los Caballeros, and the execution of the deserters. I'd say Canto 16 would be the next main point, which is where we kind of start to shift the narrative away from Oñate being the central focus towards the common settler soldier setting the focus. Canto 17 covers the visit to the plains that Oñate did. During this visit especially, and some other events throughout, Villagrá almost seems to pine for some form of coexistence between the indigenous tribes that they're interacting with and the Spanish. One coexistence that I'll hope for would be inevitably snuffed out with the events at Acoma at the end of the poem. Canto 18 covers the first trip to Acoma. It also mentions Zutucapan, a central leader against the Spanish in Acoma, who, at least the way he's portrayed by Villagrá, most of it would probably be a fabrication, as Villagrá wouldn't have been there himself to actually witness these events. There wouldn't have been anyone from the Spanish there either to be present for some of these events. But one thing, again, kind of to compare to the Aeneid and the Odyssey and the Iliad, he kind of creates this cast of the native resistance to the Spanish, Zutucapan being one of the central ones, the Menelaus to Homer's Achilles. So he's kind of setting up some of those rivalries and giving these people a voice. But we do have to be careful when we're reading the poem that we don't read too far into this. Again, Villagrá wouldn't have been present for the leaders of Acoma meeting on whether they're going to kill all the Spanish or not, and nor would anyone who really would have been able to give reliable testimony be there. In this first visit to Acoma is also when the first mention of the plot to kill Oñate is brought up, which is, if you remember, they're going to lead him into the kiva. When he gets into the kiva, they're going to kill him. Oñate, by luck or by sensing that there's some trap, manages to avoid this fate, though. From here on out, there's a clear change in the quality of the work. Well, I found the first half to third of the poem to be a slog. I mean, there's points where he's including the full legal documents that would be accompanying the expedition just right in the middle of a canto. There's definitely a quality improvement here, especially when we get to the final third, the climax of the poem. I was actually starting to think around this point that I don't know if I really want to talk about this beyond, hey, this exists, it's kind of a slog. Villagrá also does some more jumping around before the actual treason at Acoma that takes up the last third of the poem. Canto 19 is about Villagra's own struggles in delivering the information to Oñate about Acoma's treason. He covers his horse getting killed in a trap. He talks about having to put his boots on backwards so he could make his tracks seem like he's going the wrong direction, which in theory would make him harder to track. He has this really tear-jerking scene where he has to kill this dog that he has with him and eat it to survive in the cold, and it's miserable. He talks about coming to this water hole. Some have posited this is probably El Moro, which was a common watering hole along the route between Acoma and Zuni in this time period. If you remember in the main narrative, Oñate also carved Oñate and many others would carve inscriptions here. He also had an aside in this whole section, kind of revealing his own doubts at the time and presumably the doubts of the other men on the expedition about how the whole expedition had been super expensive and they had pretty much nothing to show for it. There wasn't mountains of wealth in New Mexico like they had been promised. Around this time, he also starts to allude to a little bit about what's going to happen to some people after the expedition, but he never really gets too deep into that. Finally, in Canto 21, we enter the seminal moment of the third part, the decision for treason by Acoma with a council of war. Again, Villagrá probably wouldn't have been present, nor would any of Spaniard be present for this council of war. Villagrá used this as a rhetorical strategy to critique the empire he is serving. He uses this to take some jabs at how the Spanish are too focused on whom one is descended from, of being, noble blood, when in reality, when according to the Catholic dogma of the Spanish, all of them, from king down to peasant, are all descended from the same line of Adam. This is also where the ambush at Acoma and the death of Juan de Zaldivar is given. Canto 23 is about Zaldivar's death, and Oñate gives kind of the following account. Quote, "Let sorrow be renewed, let hoarse accents of weeping come with funeral sorrow, for the lamentable, cruel, brave death of that most brave man who, bursting through 1,000 furious barbarian troops, with his terrible, powerful sword, did spill forth a whole sea of fresh blood. 3 long hours, brave, he sustained all the enormous and portentous weight of that most bloody battle, a new Mars, with such surpassing courage and effort as he were all of one pure bronze." End quote. Throughout, and I will continue to do so, I'm going to skip some of the more violent parts of the poem, but he's pretty much describing here what he had heard about Zaldivar's death or what he himself invented. He then continues on with Oñate's own reaction to hearing the news that his nephew had been slain, and how the cases for war was drawn up, as well as what justifications the Spanish gave to destroy Acoma. Unlike many, again, there's some more inclusion of the actual physical legal documents, or at least the text of these legal documents that the Spanish would have drawn up with their justifications. Canto 25 is where we kind of enter the final quarter of the poem, the actual battle and aftermath of Acoma. For the remaining cantos up to the attack of Acoma, he switches kind of back and forth between the Acoma response to what the Spanish are doing and what the Spanish are actually doing. For instance, he covers the women setting up watch on the roofs of San Juan de los Caballeros, and he also covers how the people of Acoma are preparing for the Spanish attack. The battle itself begins around Canto 29, although he does kind of start laying some of the groundwork in Canto 28. The last 6 cantos of the poem cover the Spanish battle for the Pueblo in gory detail. It's pretty violent, so I'm going to skip most of it, but he continues to use kind of very similar language to what you'd see in the Aeneid or the Odyssey or the Iliad to compare the heroes of his story to those of antiquity, such as when he compares Vicente de Zaldivar to the famed Scipio, or the following from Canto 30, quote, "That Zatu Capan and all the people together would fail him at any time, did make them bind themselves and take an oath, according to their laws, rites, and customs, as Hannibal once swore upon the fanes and altars of his gods, that he would be ever a mortal foe to the Romans, so that they would keep inviolate." End quote. When narrating his own presence and participation in the actual events at Acoma, such as when he jumps across the gap to grab the board to help, again, we talked about some of this in the main narrative about the actual attack on Acoma, he strikes a humble tone, which would be expected of the time. He also keeps with the tradition of maintaining the perception of an enemy hero. In this case, Gicombo, one of the Acomas, is kind of the enemy hero to the Spanish. He also exhorts how valiant his companions were, saying that they would have been able to supplant the 12 peers of France, if only he had been as brave as they were. Again, the real hero of the epic is not any one man, but instead the common soldier used and thrown away by the empire they served. Canto 31 covers how the Pueblo was won and set to the torch. As for the burning of the Pueblo, his description is very similar to that used in the Aeneid for the destruction of Troy. He also mentions the holdout in the unburned parts of the Pueblo and how the remainder of it, quote, "did show itself a second labyrinth," end quote. Canto 32 is the conclusion of all the Acoma heroes Villagrá has introduced in his epic in his poem, covering their and their family's final demise. Some kill themselves, others throw themselves from the mesa, some go to die with their loved ones. Canto 32 is how Zaldivar sought his brother's bones, and I want to quote it in full because it's, again, I think it's a very well put together part of the poem. Quote, We asked them straight to take us to the place where they had dealt the army master's death, and they did take us there without delay. And there we saw as large a stain of blood as 2 extended arms might well compass, the unfortunate sergeant having seen the blood of his dear brother now deceased, though it was now congealed and all turned black. Without fire he did yet begin to feel a seething deep in his sensitive heart, and at the same time there did come a choking lump that quite filled up his grieving throat and held it fast, and his austere eyes were changed into 2 boundless seas, and shed 1,000 rivulets of copious tears, with which to dolorous and sad weeping he moved us and did bring us all, as no one had the strength to restrain him. He then burst through the midst of all, and throwing himself on the stain, groaning most bitterly, he did give way to grief for the sad blood spilled there." End quote. He also continues with what actually Vicente was crying out as he was grieving his brother. Quote, "To his much grieved and overburdened throat, he thus began to wail his affliction. This was no end that I was hoping for, when for such labors and for such miseries we wish to offer ourselves and enlist. For in those times I truly thought, like a new soldier, a recruit, that we too should acquire great fame, and promised us right honorable lots, filled up with victory and sure triumph." End quote. His lamentations continue for several more lines before he turns to his men and gives a speech to mark the victory. Quote, "Here was Troy, noble cavaliers, here for this high effort and ardent zeal, and for his great valor, famous and rare, he shall remain forever eternized, and known throughout all later times, continuing the great reputation gained by all of his great ancestors and forebears." End quote. The final canto continues to wrap up the fate of the Acamas. It ends with one final act of defiance from the pueblo with 2 men holed up in a kiva. Quote, "And having now with much great pleasure received the news, the general was then informed by certain noble, friendly barbarians that those prisoners whom he had shut up inside the kiva and retained in custody were of the bravest and most valiant that Acoma could show, and that they had raised the outbreak to its highest point and roused the peaceful fortress that was now destroyed. At this, 2 barbarians, enraged, seeing themselves discovered, did destroy the ladder of the kiva, and grown strong, with clubs and blows of rocks they prevented the entrance of anyone for 3 days. So well they did defend and keep themselves, and seeing that they must needs surrender through their hunger and the raging thirst they felt, they then laid down their arms and said, 'Castilians, if you are not content as yet, though you have drunk up all the generous blood that succulent, tireless bravery has already had, and only this bit that is left to us will satisfy you, then give us 2 blunt knives, 1 for each, that we may here appease your throats for you, taking our lives ourselves. For it is right that no one may say to stain us, that 2 such warriors place themselves in hands so infamous and vile as your hands, which we despise.' At this the general was told by all of his barbarian friends that if he gave the pardon, he would put all of the land in a mind to revolt, as he had done in vain all that could have been done to see them surrendered and added to the bosom of the church. He ordered that they be refused the knives for greater safety, and that they be given 2 long, strong halters, well and truly made. And throwing these inside, they looked at them, with eyes bloodshot and pressing tight their lips in their strong teeth, their sides swollen, their nostrils wide. Absorbed, deaf, dumb, they did remain. And being thus quiet for a time, throwing off fear and despising all of your army and your mighty sword, never was seen thus to give up his neck unto the running noose, a man who, being tired of this life, desired to leave this life swiftly and soon, as we saw these barbarians who, at once, loosing their badly tangled hair, took the 2 nooses, and, setting the same upon their necks and knotting them, they came out of the kiva, and casting their glance over the camp, which wondered much at their courage and sympathized with them, they halted it and centered it upon some lofty poplar trees that were well grown, and were, by some evil chance, near. And hardly had they noted them when they informed us instantly they wished to hang themselves and die upon those trees. And, giving them an open hand in all, the great and choking knots, hard drawn, there they examined, and, dragging their halters behind them, went from the Castilian camp, worn out, accompanied by the barbarian folk, not the strong brothers of Carthage, who, running rapidly, increased the boundaries to their own dole, did thus give themselves up unto dark death, allowing themselves to be buried, though alive, as these barbarians, who, arriving at the foot of those tree trunks, lifted up their gaze unto the top, and instantly, like skillful cabin boys who run lightly upon the masts and yards and high tops, climbed the poplars to a great height, and then, testing the branches, appeared as their own hangman. And having tied the ropes, looking upon us all, they said to us, Soldiers, take note that hanging here from these strong tree trunks we leave you, our miserable bodies as spoils, of the illustrious victory you won, over those wretched ones who are rotting amid their weltering blood. Their sepulchre they chose, since infamous. Fortune chose so to pursue us, with powerful hand and end our days. You will remain joyful, for we now close the doors of life and take our leave, and freely leave to you our lands. Sleep sure and safe, because no one ever returned with news about the road. Uncertain and laborious we now take. But yet, of one thing we do assure you, that if we can return for our vengeance, Castilian mothers shall not bear, barbarian either, throughout all the world, sons more unfortunate than all of you. Thus raving, angry, all heedless, together they both leapt out into space. End quote. The curse they call out at the end echoes that of the Aeneid, and instead of the glory of the coming Spanish Empire to New Mexico, the poem is celebrating two corpses. Villagrá has a small description of their death, and then concludes by alluding to a second part of the poem that was never created. He never gets to the punishment handed down by Oñate, but perhaps that was to be included in this missing second part. The poem itself is widely criticized as a literary work. Even in the introduction to my translation of the poem is harsh. Quote, in effect, Villagrá's poem contains practically nothing that may be considered novelistic or fantastic, and makes only a minimal concession, unlike Historia, for example, to the interpolation of a subjectively lyrical poetic vein. If one discounts the almost necessary fictionalization of the Achaemenid world, to which the narrator had little access, Historia de la Nueva Mexico interpolates no fictional passages other than the long retelling of the legendary coming of the primitive Mexicans, Aztecs, and the relative short interlude of the enamored Indian woman Pilca, a fixed topos of the New World epic. End quote. Although the book Daring Flight of My Pen provides a great response to these criticisms, when describing another author claiming that there is nothing valuable in Villagrá's work. Quote, Quint's insistence on this point is based on the assumption that Villagrá's minor epic, a poem written in doggerel verse, could not possibly exhibit the kinds of intellectual and emotional complexity that would make the final scenes of battle and the destruction of Acoma disclose Villagrá's self-doubts about his own role in the assault, nor his thinking through of the arrogance and spirit-killing nature of empire. What I really want to say about the post-colonial template, though, is that the figure of the conquistador is forever stuck in an ideological ironclad model. A conquistador is a. This template will not allow room for internal complexities in a literary work that emerged during empire. End quote. Of the entire poem, I found the final third, the events of Acoma, to be the parts that really shone. It's when Villagrá really comes into his own, and instead of lengthy historical documents being included or just dry prose. I agree with much from this quote, though, from the Daring Flight of My Pen. Quote, then as now, I believe, soldiers did not kill without nightmare confusion afterwards. So it seems to me that Acoma, the desert, Cervantes' Numancia, the Aeneid, Heresia's Araucana, much of the Trojan cycle, and the stories of the conquest of Mexico told a century later would have crowded upon Villagrá. End quote. What I found so powerful about his portrayal is that Villagrá through the poem gives names and words to the indigenous people. He endeavors to make them human and to make their deaths not just the glorious heroic Spaniard over the evil, treacherous barbarian. He does a fantastic job describing the battle itself in all its gory detail. I don't think Villagrá just wrote the poem just to beg for money from the king, although that is a part of why he wrote it, nor is it to absolve himself from the legal troubles people like Oñate would be running into around this time. I think part of it was to try and come to terms himself with the events that he had participated in, such as the events at Acoma. The words he puts into Acoma's leaders, such as Atucapan, while a critique of the empire, are Spanish in origin and no way representative of the actual discussions taking place at Acoma, nor are the names necessarily those of the Acomas actually involved in resisting the Spanish. Villagrá's epic poem, Historia de Nuevo Mexico, while not a bestseller, fit itself into an existing tradition of Latin American literature that was just beginning to emerge at the time. I would not call it a work of high art either, but it is the first thing that could be called Nuevo Mexicano writing. It also holds another important distinction. Being published in 1610, it is the first history published about what would become part of the United States. I want to bring my discussion of the text to a close with one final note from the Daring Flight of My Pen that I think does a really good job talking about how modern New Mexicans, especially those of Hispanic descent, still struggle with some of the same things that Villagrá struggled with. For context here, Eddie is the author of that book's cousin who was a veteran. Quote, we can critique empire all we want from the comfort of our university offices, but it is people like Eddie and that other soldier Gaspar Pérez de Villagrá, who fired the guns. Villagrá and his companions carried out the massacre at Acoma as part of an imperial killing machine, but they were not themselves machines. However unfeeling, we assume them to have been under their suits of steel. Looking away, Eddie told me that he woke up every day, remembering what he had done. After nightmares of broken bodies, a carnival of killing, he had to decide each morning if he would face the world or kill himself. What I, sitting at my desk, can only guess at by reading. More than any book I have read, it was Eddie who taught me in that wrenching conversation that soldiers carry the violence of battle with them throughout their lives. Men who have killed people in war, he told me, with words, eyes, and a clenched physicality, do not forget, nor usually do they gloat. Villagrá wrote an epic to memorialize empire, and yet, as we shall see, his verse does not revel in the blood gush of images. Like Eddie, he is self-effacing, hardly present in his own narrative, and yet everywhere narrating war. When called to duty, he carried out his orders, and then slighted himself as unimportant, whether as a reconnaissance scout or when he threw a log across the chasm atop Acoma to save his fellow soldiers during the onset of the battle. Perhaps this is false humility, as some of his readers believe. The violence that burdens memory, though, his own experience in war, conflated with the archetypal landscapes of Homer and Virgil, produce an exchanging juxtaposition between Villagrá the soldier and Villagrá the poem. End quote. I want to shift gears now and talk about everything we've covered up to now, as there's been a lot, and it'll be good to set the stage for the future. Over the past 10 or so episodes, we have covered everything from the initial Spanish entradas under people like Coronado or Chamuscado, to Oñate finally establishing the Kingdom of New Mexico, and then from there on through the Pueblo Revolt and the reestablishing of New Mexico under Spanish rule under de Vargas. In the initial exploration phase, you have stories of people like Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, Esteban, and the other survivors of the Narvaez expedition brought back with them, as well as other stories that were circulating around the Spanish New World at the time. This inspired the Viceroy to send Friar Marcos de Niza and Esteban to investigate these rumors. Esteban would speed ahead of the friar, sending back ever-exaggerated crosses for Friar Marcos until he would be killed at the Zuni Pueblo of Hawaku. Friar Marcos may have laid eyes on the Zuni Pueblos, or he may have not. Either way, he would return to Mexico City with fantastical stories about the 7 cities of Cibola, as cities of gold. These stories, albeit facetious, would spark the Viceroy to send Francisco Vázquez de Coronado to investigate. Coronado would arrive at Hawaku and take the Pueblo by storm. He would then start a war with the Tihuex Pueblos, near modern Albuquerque, that would end with the Pueblos in the area mostly abandoned. After finding little in New Mexico, Coronado would follow rumors provided by Isapote, El Turco, and perhaps even Bigotes at Pecos Pueblo to investigate Quivira out in modern Kansas. After a brief aside to the south among the Tayas, they made their way north and found little. Here is where they would kill El Turco. After returning to the Tihuex Pueblos, Coronado would winter there, planning to return to the areas beyond Quivira the next year. However, after falling from his horse and suffering an injury, he decided it was time to head back to Mexico. Coronado's failed expedition pushed Spanish intrusion into New Mexico by about a generation, until after the establishment of the mining settlements of northern Mexico, and after the Spanish had lowered their expectations for things like encomiendas. From there, several expeditions, both legal and illegal, would push the Spanish crown to act. These would be all those other expeditions we talked about, like Chamuscado, Espejo, De Sosa, Bonilla y Humana, and all the rest. After much setbacks and deliberation, they would choose Juan de Oñate to establish the Kingdom of New Mexico, which he would do in 1598. For the next 80 years, the Pueblos would toil under Spanish abuses, such as the encomienda and repartimiento systems, as well as other events such as the massacre at Acoma that further inflamed tensions between the two groups. While the Pueblos toiled, the Spanish fought between who was in charge, the church or the state. This would lead to several attempted revolts. Eventually, the Pueblos would unite under the enigmatic Pope in 1689 and push the Spanish out. The fragile Pueblo alliance would begin to break down, however, and that would give Don Pedro de Vargas his opportunity to reestablish the kingdom. To help ensure longer-term stability, he would do away with the hated encomiendas, but he would keep the repartimiento systems. The church and state had different goals for the first 100 years or so of the colony of New Mexico. The Franciscans wanted to basically create a theocracy where they converted all the Pueblos and they were the primary movers politically. They did this by trying to keep the population low and hampering the governors at every turn, even going so far as to arrest or kill some governors. Meanwhile, the governors wanted to enrich themselves and make the province defensible from raids by Plains tribes. They did this by undermining the friars' conversion efforts for economic interests or to ensure they had recruits from the Pueblos. At times, this would almost lead to civil war. Throughout it all, the Spanish crown was almost passive. They had little interest in this far-flung colony at the end of the world. Some historians have described the first 100 years or so of New Mexico's existence as the Spanish and the Pueblos trying to figure out how to live together. While that was a part of this, Instead, I'd describe it more as an identity crisis. The Kingdom of New Mexico had been founded because it seemed inevitable that a colony would be founded, and the crown wanted to ensure that it controlled the founding. But unlike Mexico or Peru, there was no easy fortune to be had. Unlike Zacatecas to the south, there was no great mineral wealth to be mined as of yet. New Mexico was a government with no goal, and like a ship without a rudder, it drained aimlessly from goal to goal, be it conversion, the Indian slave trade, or even abandonment, as was considered several times throughout the colony's history. We can't forget that the crown did consider giving up under Oñate, and reconquest had never been guaranteed by the Spanish crown. However, with the return of de Vargas and really the return of the Spanish to New Mexico, the crown kind of seemed to get its act together a little bit. And we'll talk about some of the events that actually led to the crown getting their act together in future episodes. And for the remainder of the Spanish colonial period, that would be what the Spanish focused on. And that goal would be primarily around defense of the mining settlements of Zacatecas and the heartlands of New Spain. With the turn of the century, there will be events that lead, and we'll talk about them in future episodes, that lead to kind of a change in the direction of the history of New Mexico, from being just, hey, we need a colony here because we need a colony here, to really having a focused goal, especially as we see near the end of the Spanish colonial period and the beginning of the Mexican period. With that, I think I'll wrap up everything here. Thank you so much for listening.
If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads. We have a website located at engineeringfire.org. That's spelled ENGINEERINGFIRE.org, where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.